The rain tasted like exhaust fumes and cheap asphalt. Arthur wanted a cigarette. Instead, he got a small, filthy hand tugging at his $3,000 cashmere coat. "Sir," the kid whispered, voice cracking over the low, mechanical rumble of the city. "My mom is crying in the alley." The neon sign above the pawn shop buzzed, a dying insect trapped in a glass tube. Arthur Cole stood beneath the awning, letting the erratic red light wash over his face. He felt hollowed out, scraped clean by the preceding 3 hours. He had just condemned a man to a wheelchair for the rest of his natural life. It was business. It was necessary. It also left a sour, metallic taste at the back of his throat that scotch couldn't wash away. He reached into his pocket for his lighter. The silver casing was cold against his thumb. Before he could strike the flint, a slight weight dragged at his hem. Arthur looked down. He didn't jump. Men in his profession who startled easily didn't live to see 40. His dark eyes locked onto a child, a boy, maybe 6 years old, wearing a faded puffer jacket 2 sizes too big. The kid's sneakers were soaked through, dark with city sludge. "Sir," the boy said again. His chin trembled, though whether from the biting November wind or sheer terror, Arthur couldn't tell. "My mom is crying in the alley. She won't get up." Arthur stared at him. The logical part of his brain, the part that kept him at the top of the city's underground food chain, told him to walk away. This wasn't his problem. The streets were full of crying mothers, broken fathers, and starving kids. He was usually the reason they were crying. "Where is your father?" Arthur asked. His voice was a low gravel, devoid of warmth. "Gone," the boy stated. It wasn't a lament. It was a matter of fact. Arthur sighed, the breath pluming white in the freezing air. He didn't want to do this. He wanted his driver to pull up. He wanted to go back to his penthouse, and he wanted to drink until the ghost of the man he'd ruined stopped staring at him from the corners of the room. But the kid wasn't letting go of his coat. The small knuckles were white. "Show me," Arthur muttered. The boy released the fabric and darted into the narrow, lightless gap between a boarded-up deli and a dry cleaner. Arthur followed, his leather shoes stepping carefully over broken glass and waterlogged cardboard. The smell hit him instantly: stale beer, rotting produce, and the sharp, unmistakable tang of fresh copper. Blood. Deep in the shadows, pressed against the brick wall beside a rusted dumpster, sat a woman. She had her knees pulled up to her chest, her face buried in her arms. A ripped plastic grocery bag lay beside her, spilled cans of cheap soup rolling into the puddles. "Mom," the boy whispered, crouching beside her. He patted her matted hair with a dirty hand. "I got someone." The woman's head snapped up. Arthur stopped a few feet away, hands buried deep in his overcoat pockets. Her name was Clara, though he wouldn't know that until later. Right now, she was just a portrait of desperate, cornered rage. Her lip was split, a jagged tear welling with dark blood. Her cheekbone was swelling into a bruised purple mountain. Mascara ran down her face in messy, chaotic tracks, but her eyes, pale, striking green, were wide and fiercely hostile. She didn't look at him like a savior. She looked at him like a predator. Given his tailored suit, his sharp jawline, and the cold stillness of his posture, she wasn't entirely wrong. "Get away from us," she hissed. Her voice was raspy, ruined by crying and cold. She scrambled to pull the boy behind her, shielding him with her own battered body. "Your kid asked for help," Arthur said. He didn't soften his tone. He didn't crouch down to her level. "I'm just answering a request. We don't need help. We don't need money. Just walk away." She was shivering violently now, her thin trench coat offering zero protection against the wind tunneling through the alley. Arthur looked at the spilled soup cans. He looked at the blood on her chin. He felt a sudden, inexplicable surge of irritation, not at her, but at the sheer pathetic reality of it all. He was a monster who broke the rules, and here was someone broken by them. "You're bleeding," Arthur observed flatly. "You're freezing, and if you stay out here, someone much worse than me is going to find you." Clara let out a choked, bitter laugh. "Worse than you? You look like the devil himself." "Then consider this a deal," Arthur replied. He pulled a pristine white handkerchief from his breast pocket and tossed it onto her lap. It landed softly against her damp jeans. "Wipe your face. Get up. I'll buy the kid a meal." Then you can go back to freezing in an alley if you really want to." She stared at the handkerchief like it was a live grenade. She didn't move. Arthur turned his back to her, looking out toward the neon-lit street. 2 minutes. Then I leave." He listened to the silence behind him, broken only by the boy's quiet sniffling and the dripping of rain from the fire escape above. He fully expected to walk away alone. He was almost hoping for it. It would absolve him. But then he heard the scrape of sneakers on wet asphalt, the rustle of damp fabric, and a shaky exhale. When he glanced over his shoulder, Clara was standing. She was unsteady, leaning heavily against the damp brick, pressing his monogrammed handkerchief to her bleeding mouth. The boy was holding her other hand tightly. "Where?" she asked, her voice tight with distrust. Arthur didn't smile. "There's a diner 2 blocks down. It's bright. It's safe." He started walking, not looking back to see if they followed. He knew they would. Desperation didn't afford the luxury of choice. The diner smelled of scorched coffee beans and industrial bleach. It was a harsh, unforgiving odor, amplified by the flickering fluorescent tubes overhead that cast everyone in a sickly, green-tinged pallor. Arthur chose a booth in the far back, facing the door. Old habits. The red vinyl seat hissed as he slid into it, the springs groaning in protest. Clara sat opposite him. She kept her jacket zipped to the collar despite the stifling heat of the restaurant. Leo, the boy, slid in beside her, his wide eyes tracking the greasy, laminated menus the tired waitress tossed onto the table. 3 coffees, Arthur said, not looking at the waitress, and a grilled cheese with fries for the kid. Bring him a hot chocolate, too. I can't pay for that, Clara said immediately, her hand shooting out to cover Leo's. I didn't ask you to, Arthur replied. He finally took his eyes off the entrance and looked at her. Really looked at her under the harsh lights. She was young, maybe late 20s, but exhaustion had carved deep lines around her mouth and eyes. Her hair, drying now in the diner's heat, was a dark, mousy brown, tangled and lacking any kind of care. The bruise on her cheekbone was darkening to an ugly shade of plum. She was actively trying to shrink into the corner of the booth, making herself as small a target as possible. Yet, her chin was tilted up, a fragile, pathetic sort of defiance. "Why are you doing this?" Clara asked. She lowered the blood-stained handkerchief. The split lip had stopped bleeding, but it looked painful. "Your kid was persistent," Arthur said, pulling his lighter out again, turning it over and over in his long fingers. The repetitive motion was grounding. "People like you don't just help people like me." Arthur paused the lighter. "And what kind of people am I?" Clara's eyes flicked over his clothes. "The suit costs more than my life. Your knuckles are bruised. You sit facing the exit, and you haven't blinked since we walked in here. You're dangerous." A dark, cynical amusement tugged at the corner of Arthur's mouth. Observant. "Desperate people learn to read the room," she countered bitterly. "So, I'll ask again. What's the catch? Do you want to traffic me? Use the boy?" Arthur's amusement vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, leaden weight in his gut. The fact that her mind went there, that this was her baseline expectation of the world, made him sick. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the sticky formica table. "Listen to me carefully," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a low, quiet register that usually made grown men sweat. "I am not a good man, but I do not touch women, and I do not hurt children. I bought you a cup of coffee because it was raining and your kid looked hungry. That is the beginning, middle, and end of the transaction." Clara stared at him, searching his dark eyes for a lie. She didn't find one, but the tension in her shoulders didn't ease. The waitress returned, dropping the mugs and a plate heavily onto the table. The hot chocolate spilled over the rim, staining the paper placemat. Leo didn't wait for permission. He grabbed a fry and shoved it into his mouth, moaning softly in appreciation. Clara watched him, a flash of pure, agonizing guilt crossing her face before she hid it behind her coffee mug. Arthur watched her hands. They were trembling so badly the dark liquid rippled inside the heavy ceramic. "Who hit you?" Arthur asked. The question was blunt. He didn't care about tact. Clara froze. She slowly lowered the mug. "It's a misunderstanding, a personal issue. Personal issues don't usually leave you bleeding by a dumpster with spilled groceries. It's none of your business." Her voice grew sharp again. Defensive. Arthur leaned back, interlacing his fingers. True, but I'm bored, and you're sitting at my table. Humor me. Clara looked away, watching a car drive past the rain-streaked window. The silence stretched between them, heavy and fraught. Arthur let it sit. He knew how to wait. He had waited outside buildings for hours in the freezing cold just to put a bullet in a man's chest. He could wait for a woman to speak. "My ex-husband," Clara finally whispered, the words tasting like ash. "He had a gambling problem. He left town 2 months ago. Turns out he didn't leave his debts behind. He transferred them to my name." Arthur's jaw tightened imperceptibly. Loan sharks. Clara let out a wet, miserable laugh. Worse. Syndicate. Real, organized garbage. She traced the rim of her coffee mug, avoiding his gaze. "They came to the apartment tonight. Said I missed a payment. I didn't even know I was making payments. They took whatever cash I had, slapped me around a bit to make a point, and told me I have a week to come up with 30 grand. 30,000, pocket change to Arthur, a death sentence to her." "Did the guy give a name?" Arthur asked. His voice was dangerously calm now. The exhaustion he felt earlier was evaporating, replaced by a cold, familiar hum of focus. Clara hesitated. "I shouldn't." "Name," Arthur repeated. "It wasn't a request. It was an order." Clara flinched slightly at his tone. "Rossi." The guy's name was Paulie Rossi. He said he worked for the Cole family. Arthur didn't react. He didn't blink. He just stared at the greasy surface of the table. Paulie Rossi, a mid-level enforcer under his own capo. The irony was thick enough to choke on. He had pulled this woman out of the gutter to absolve himself of his sins for the evening, only to find out that his own empire had put her there in the first place. The money she owed, the money she bled for, was destined for Arthur's own vault. He looked at Leo, who was blissfully dragging a grilled cheese sandwich through a pool of ketchup. Then he looked at Clara, bruised, terrified, and utterly broken by a system Arthur controlled. "Rossi," Arthur murmured, the name tasting like rust on his tongue. "I see. You asked," Clara said defensively. "Now you know. We're a liability. You should walk away while you can." Arthur finally picked up his coffee. It was black, bitter, and lukewarm. He took a slow sip. "I'm not walking away," he said quietly. "In fact, I think Mr. Rossi and I are going to have a very productive conversation." The black sedan idled at the curb, its engine a low, barely perceptible thrum. Arthur opened the rear door himself. The interior smelled of expensive cedar polish and conditioned leather. Clara stopped on the wet pavement, her grip on Leo's hand tightening until the boy whimpered slightly. She looked at the cavernous, dark backseat, then up at Arthur. The streetlights caught the sharp angles of his face, rendering him in stark contrasts of pale skin and deep shadow. "Get in," Arthur said. The rain had started again, a fine, freezing mist that clung to the wool of his coat. "Where are we going?" Clara asked. Her voice was flat, the adrenaline wearing off, leaving only a brittle, hollow shell of exhaustion. "To a hotel. A safe one. My driver, Hayes, will wait outside your door." Arthur gestured to the man behind the wheel, who offered a brief, impassive nod in the rearview mirror. "You sleep. You shower. You don't open the door for anyone but me." Clara didn't argue. She couldn't. The sheer gravitational pull of fatigue was dragging her down. She slid into the car, pulling Leo in after her. The heavy door shut with a solid, airtight thud, cutting off the noise of the city. Arthur watched the taillights disappear down the slick avenue before he turned and began walking in the opposite direction. He pulled his phone from his pocket, dialing a number he rarely used. The phone rang twice. "Yeah, boss." The voice on the other end was rough, thick with sleep. "Where does Paulie Rossi run his books on a Tuesday night?" Arthur asked, his boots crunching over discarded gravel. There was a brief pause, the sound of rustling sheets. "The back room of the Rusty Anchor, down by the docks. You want me to send a crew?" "No," Arthur said, hanging up. The Rusty Anchor was exactly what it sounded like. A decaying harbor bar that smelled of stale beer, pine cleaner, and generations of bad decisions. Arthur walked through the front door, ignoring the bartender who froze mid-pour, recognizing the cut of the suit, if not the man himself. Arthur bypassed the sticky bar area, moving straight for the reinforced steel door at the back of the hallway. Two heavy-set men stood flanking it. They stepped forward, their hands dropping to their waistbands. Arthur didn't slow his pace. He didn't even look at them. He simply raised his head, letting the dim, flickering hallway bulb illuminate his face. The men stopped. The color drained from the larger one's face. He stepped aside, pulling his partner by the sleeve, leaving the door wide open. Arthur pushed the door inward. The room was thick with cigar smoke and the sharp, acidic tang of cheap whiskey. 4 men sat around a green felt table, stacks of wrinkled 20s and 50s piled in the center. At the head of the table sat Paulie Rossi. He was a thick, greasy man in a track jacket, currently laughing at a joke that died the second the heavy door clicked shut. Rossi looked up. His eyes widened, his mouth falling slightly open, exposing a gold-capped molar. "Mr. Cole," Rossi choked out, scrambling to stand. His chair scraped violently against the concrete floor. The other 3 men scrambled up, backing away from the table, trying to make themselves invisible. We didn't expect you down here, sir." Arthur didn't speak. He walked slowly to the table. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic dripping of a leaky pipe somewhere in the walls. Arthur stopped at the edge of the table, looking down at the scattered cards. He reached out, his long fingers picking up a discarded queen of spades. "You're a busy man, Paulie," Arthur murmured, his voice conversational. It was a terrifying tone. It lacked any heat, any passion. It was purely administrative. "Just keeping the books straight, boss. Earning for the family," Rossi stammered. Sweat was beginning to bead on his forehead, catching the glare of the overhead lamp. "Earning," Arthur repeated. He dropped the card. He looked up, locking eyes with Rossi. "You visited a woman tonight, Clara. An apartment on 4th and Elm. You collected a debt." Rossi swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Yeah. Yes, sir. Her ex-husband ran up 30 large at the tables. He skipped. Standard procedure, boss. The debt transfers. I just went to put a little pressure on, that's all." Pressure. Arthur took a slow step around the table. The 3 other men pressed themselves flat against the cinder block wall. "You split her lip. You bruised her cheek. You left her and a 6-year-old child freezing in an alley." Rossi's eyes darted frantically around the room, looking for a lifeline that didn't exist. "Boss, with respect, it's just business. She owes the family. We have to set an example, or everyone starts thinking they can walk away from a marker." Arthur stopped directly in front of Rossi. The smell of the man was overwhelming fear, stale sweat, and an offensive, musky cologne. "The system is designed to make money, Paulie. It is not designed for you to play God with desperate women in cheap apartments," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "The debt is canceled." "But the 30 grand," Rossi started. Arthur's hand moved faster than the eye could track. He grabbed Rossi by the throat, slamming him backward into the heavy metal filing cabinet. The impact shook the room. The cheap track jacket bunched in Arthur's iron grip. Rossi gagged, his hands flying up to claw at Arthur's wrist, but Arthur's arm was rigid, pinning the heavier man entirely. "The debt is canceled," Arthur repeated, his face inches from Rossi's sweating face. "If you go near that apartment again, if you speak her name, if you even think about the $30,000, I will have Hayes take you to the Pine Barrens and you will not come back. Do you understand?" Rossi nodded frantically, his face turning a mottled, ugly shade of purple as his air supply dwindled. Arthur held him there for 3 more seconds, letting the reality of the threat seep into Rossi's bones. Then he let go. Rossi collapsed to the floor, coughing violently, dragging air into his burning lungs. Arthur adjusted his cuffs. He didn't look down. He turned and walked out of the room, leaving the door open behind him. The air outside the club tasted like rotting fish and diesel, but compared to the room he had just left, it felt remarkably clean. The hotel suite was silent. It was a dense, insulated quiet, entirely divorced from the chaotic hum of the city 20 floors below. Arthur stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, a glass of amber liquid sweating in his hand. The morning sun was just beginning to break over the skyline, casting the city in bruised shades of gray and pale yellow. He hadn't slept. He rarely did. Behind him, the bedroom door clicked open. Arthur didn't turn around. He heard the soft pad of bare feet against the plush carpet. Clara walked into the living area, wearing one of the hotel's oversized white robes. She looked frail inside it, but the harsh, hunted look in her eyes had dulled slightly after a hot shower and 8 hours of sleep. She walked over to the minibar, pouring herself a glass of tap water. Her hand was steady now. "Leo is still sleeping," Clara said, her voice raspy. She took a slow sip of the water. "Your man outside, Hayes. He ordered us breakfast. He seems polite." "Hayes is a professional," Arthur replied, finally turning away from the glass. He took a seat in the velvet armchair, resting his elbows on his knees, holding the glass of scotch loosely between his palms. Clara stood by the marble counter, watching him. In the stark, unromantic morning light, the bruise on her face was a vivid, ugly testament to the night before. "So," Clara said, leaning back against the counter, "what now? The sun is up. The rain stopped. Are we still part of the transaction?" Arthur looked at his glass, watching the ice slowly melt into the liquor. This was the moment. The pivot point where he could maintain the illusion of the dark night, the wealthy stranger who swooped in to save the day. It would be easy. But Arthur was tired of the lies. The hypocrisy was a bitter pill he had swallowed for too long. "I paid a visit to Paulie Rossi last night," Arthur stated, his tone deliberately neutral. Clara stiffened. The glass of water paused halfway to her mouth. You found him? You went to the police?" "No, I don't use the police." Arthur looked up, meeting her pale green eyes. "Rossi works for the Cole family. The debt you owed, the money your husband lost, it belonged to the syndicate." He watched the information hit her. It wasn't a sudden explosion of realization. It was a slow, creeping dawn of horror. She lowered the glass, setting it on the counter with a quiet, hollow clink. Her eyes traced the sharp lines of his suit, the bruising on his knuckles, the cold, predatory stillness in his posture. "Cole," she whispered. Her breath hitched. "You're Arthur Cole." "I am." Clara took a step back, her hands gripping the edge of the marble counter tightly enough to turn her knuckles white. The contradiction was breaking her brain. The man who had bought her child a warm meal, who had given her a clean bed and a locked door, was the architect of the nightmare she had been living in. He was the monster who owned the monsters. "Why?" Her voice cracked, betraying the panic rising in her throat. "Why take us out of the alley just to bring us here? What kind of sick game is this?" "It's not a game," Arthur said softly. He didn't move toward her. He stayed seated, keeping his hands visible. "I built an empire on order, Clara, on rules. But the men at the bottom, they get messy. They get cruel in ways that lack purpose. Last night, I stepped out of a meeting where I ruined a man's life for millions of dollars, and then I tripped over you in an alley, bleeding for $30,000. He sighed, running a hand over his face. It disgusted me, the sheer pathetic smallness of it. Rossi is handled. The debt is gone. He will never knock on your door again. You are clear." Clara stared at him, her chest heaving, the silence stretched, thick and vibrating with tension. The romantic script dictated that she should scream at him, throw the water in his face, grab her child, and run back out into the unforgiving streets to preserve her moral high ground. But Clara was a mother, and mothers in the real world couldn't afford moral high grounds when their children were starving. She looked away, staring at the floor. The anger was there, burning hot and bright in her chest, but it was suffocated by a profound, overwhelming exhaustion. She was tired of fighting. "Clear," she repeated, the word tasting like ash. "You broke my life, and now you've fixed it, and I'm supposed to feel, what, grateful?" "You aren't supposed to feel anything," Arthur replied, his voice devoid of pity. Pity would have insulted her. "You are simply supposed to survive." Arthur reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick, white envelope. He tossed it onto the glass coffee table between them. It landed with a heavy, muted thud. "There is $50,000 in that envelope," Arthur said. "Clean money, untraceable. Take it, pack your things. Hayes will drive you to the airport or a new city or back to your apartment. You never have to see me again. Or..." Arthur paused, his dark eyes locking onto hers, seeing straight through the frayed edges of her soul. "Or you stay," he finished quietly. "I own a building in the West District. Safe, secure, heavily monitored. I can give you an apartment there, a job in a legitimate business. You stay under my umbrella. You trade the unpredictable cruelty of the streets for the predictable shadow of a monster. Clara stared at the envelope. It was thick. It was safety. It was freedom. It was also an apology, written in blood money. She slowly walked over to the coffee table. She didn't look at Arthur. She reached down, her fingers brushing the thick paper. The texture of it felt alien compared to the damp, ripped plastic bag she had clung to in the alley. She picked it up. She didn't throw it. She didn't cry. "The West District," Clara said, her voice a fragile, hardened rasp. She finally looked up at him, her eyes stripped of innocence, replaced by a cold, pragmatic clarity. "Are the schools good?" Arthur's mouth twitched, the ghost of a deeply cynical, respectful smile appearing for a fraction of a second. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was a transaction of damaged goods. But for the first time in a long time, Arthur felt the heavy, metallic taste of guilt wash away. "They are the best in the city," Arthur answered. Clara nodded slowly. She held the envelope tight to her chest. "Then we stay." Sometimes the line between savior and villain isn't just blurred, it's erased entirely. Arthur and Clara didn't find a fairy tale ending. They forged a pragmatic pact built on survival, power, and the gritty truth of the streets. Their imperfect bond proves that sometimes the safest place to hide is right beside the monster. What did you think of Clara's choice? Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video if you want more deeply grounded, intense stories like this.